This is Precalculus, section 5.3, day 3 on trigonometric graphs. Our first example says, find the amplitude, period, and phase shift of y equals sine of 2 times x minus pi over 6, and then graph the function. So first, let's just fill out all the information that we need to make our graph. Our amplitude, or our a value here, I should say, is 1. Which means that our amplitude is going to be 1. That's our normal, like our parent. We have a k value right here in the function. Our k value is 2. So remember, if we have a k value, that is going to change our period. Our period is going to become 2 pi over k. So 2 pi over 2 tells us that our period is going to be pi. Now remember, the normal parent graph has a period of 2 pi. So our new period is going to be half the parent graph. We do have a b value right here of positive pi over 6. So that tells us that we have a phase shift of pi over 6 to the right. And then finally, our h value here after the function, our vertical shift is 0, so no vertical shift. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do, since I know that my period is pi instead of 2 pi, but I also know that I have a phase shift of pi over 6, I want to be smart about this. So I am going to count by units of pi over 6 in order to make my phase shift easy. So count by pi over 6 on x-axis to make phase shift easy. Okay. So that means that this is going to be 0. This will be pi over 6. 2 pi over 6 is pi over 3. 3 pi over 6 is pi over 2. 4 pi over 6 is 2 pi over 3. 5 pi over 6. And 6 pi over 6 is pi. Now we know our period is pi, right? So I'm not going to worry about going any further than that. Since I have a phase shift of pi over 6 to the right, my picture frame, instead of starting at 0, is just going to start at pi over 6, and then it's just going to go 1 box past pi, so another 1/6 pi past. So that's going to be 7/6 pi right here, or 7 pi over 6, and that's where my picture frame is going to end. My amplitude is 1, so my graph is just going to go from positive 1 up on the y-axis down to negative 1. And now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sketch my picture frame in here. So here's my picture frame. Sorry, 2 bars. But I already made an error here. My apologies. Remember my phase shift. I want to go from pi over 6 to 7 pi over 6. So my picture frame is going to be right. So my period is half as long as it normally would, and my picture frame is shifted over by a unit of pi over 6. It's still the length of pi. So now I know I'm graphing a sine curve. I've got my picture frame in place, so I can go ahead and plot the key points of my sine curve. I know it starts at 0, it's at 0 in the center, and it's at 0 at the end. The first half of the graph is going to be up at the maximum amplitude there in the center of the first half, and then down at the maximum amplitude at the center of the second half. So now I can go ahead and just plot my sine curve right there. And there is my graph. So again, my new picture frame here for my graph, I've got domain, or x values, from pi over 6 to pi plus pi over 6, or 7 pi over 6, however you want to think about that. And then I've got y values. Those haven't changed. My amplitude is 1, so from -1 to +1. Second example, I'm going to do the exact same thing that I did in the first example. I'm going to start by looking at all the information here for my function. This time my a value is -3, which means that my amplitude is going to be the absolute value of 3, or 3. I have a k value again. This time my k value is also 3, which is going to change my period. My period is going to be 2 pi over k, so 2 pi over 3 is going to be my period. I do not have a b, so that's 0, which means that I do not have a phase shift. And my h value is also 0, which means no vertical shift. Okay, so when we think about our picture frame, obviously since we don't have a phase shift, what we count by isn't as critical. I always like to count by pi over 6 if I'm not worried about space, and that seems easy. So here's 1 pi over 6, 2 pi over 6 is pi over 3, 3 pi over 6 is pi over 2, 4 pi over 6 is 2 pi over 3, and then we have 5 pi over 6, and of course 6 pi over 6 is our pi right there. Since my period is just 2 pi over 3, then my picture frame is going to go from 0 to 2 pi over 3. So my period is much shorter than my normal 2 pi. And I also have to consider my amplitude. Normally my amplitude is 1. This time my amplitude is going to be 3. So on the y-axis we've got +1, 2, and 3, and on the lower y-axis -1, -2, and -3. So my picture frame is going to be wider than it normally would be. All right, so let's sketch in this picture frame here. My amplitude from -3 to +3 on the y-axis, or my range, I guess you could say, and then my domain from 0 to 2 pi over 3 on the x-axis. Okay, so now I've got my picture frame sketched. Now I am going to be making my function. The one thing that we haven't talked about yet is the fact that my a value is negative. And of course that matters, right? Because a negative a value tells you that you are going to have a flip over your x-axis. So normally my cosine graph looks like a cup. This time it's going to look like an upside down cup. Okay, so everything's just going to be flipped over. So normally cosine is up at the top of my picture frame on the upper left and on the upper right. So now it's going to be at the bottom of my picture frame on the lower left and on the lower right, and it's going to be up at the top right in the center. And then of course when it crosses the x-axis, it's right in the middle here, there and there. Now keep in mind, this is not supposed to look like a V. It's got that kind of curve to it. So here's what my cosine graph should look like in its new picture frame home. Okay, so keep in mind, we had a horizontal shrink because we changed our period. We had a vertical stretch, and we had a reflection over the x-axis. Next, we're going to talk about writing trig functions if you're given a graph. So basically, this is just the reverse process. We're going to take a picture and we're going to extract from it all of the elements that we need for our equation, and then we're just going to plug them back in. So we need to know, do we have an A, do we have a K, do we have a B, do we have an H, right? Those are all the things that we have to figure out. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw in my picture frame. So here's my graph, and my picture frame is right here, okay? So what I can tell by looking at my picture frame, the first thing I notice is that the picture frame along the x-axis goes from 0 to pi, which means that my period is pi and not 2 pi, right? Well, if my period is pi, I know that 2 pi over k has to be equal to my new period, so that has to be equal to pi. So if I were to cross multiply, I end up with 2 pi equals k pi, which tells me that 2 equals my k value, right? My period is going to be pi, and I know that my k value is 2. I'm going to need that for my equation. I also noticed that my y values go from -2 up to +2. So that means that my amplitude is the absolute value of 2. That tells me that A is going to be +2. I know that A is +2 and not -2 because my cup is right side up, right? It's not upside down. So my A value is +2. I need that for my equation. And then I don't have a phase shift because my domain is from 0 to pi. It's not shifted. The starting point is not shifted away from 0. So I do not have a phase shift, which means that my value of B is 0. Okay? And then it doesn't say it on here, but also I do not have a vertical shift because the center of my graph, the x-axis, is right through the center of my picture frame, so I know that it hasn't been shifted up or down. So I have an H value of 0 as well. And of course, we already talked about it's a cup shape, so we know that this is a cosine curve. So plugging everything into our equation, we've got y equals, remember our A value comes first, so 2 cosine. Then our k value comes before the x, so 2x. And then since I don't have a vertical shift, I'm going to put +0. Okay. So that's the answer, or that is the equation for the graph that is given. In the final example, we're just given characteristics and we just have to plug them in and figure it out. So for example 1, we have a cosine function. Our period is pi over 2. We have to do a little bit of math here, okay? If our period is pi over 2, that means that 2 pi over k is equal to pi over 2. If we cross multiply, we get that k pi is equal to 2 pi times 2 is 4 pi, which tells us that k is 4. Okay, so I know that now. My amplitude is 1/3. That gives me my A value. That's 1/3. It says I have a shifted up 3 units. That's going to be my H value. And I have a phase shift of pi over 6 to the left. So remember, left means that my B is negative pi over 6. So now that I have all this information, all I need to do is write my equation by plugging everything in. It's going to be y equals, my A value is 1/3, cos, don't forget to put your k in, which is 4. I have a phase shift, so I'm going to need parentheses, and it's x minus negative pi over 6. But minus a negative, chop, chop, hiya, becomes plus pi over 6. And then we have a vertical shift of up 3. So there is the equation that goes with that information. Last example, this time we're doing a sine function. Our period is 6 pi. So 2 pi over k has to equal 6 pi over 1. We cross multiply and we get that 6k pi has to be equal to 2 pi. 6k has to be equal to 2. So that tells us 6k has to be equal to 2. So that tells us that k is equal to 1/3. Our amplitude is 4. That's our A value. And it is reflected over the x-axis. Okay, that tells us that A is negative. So then I need to make that a -4 for my A value. I don't have a B or an H, so those are just zeros. So my equation is going to be y equals my my A value is -4. My graph is a sine. My K value is 1/3 times x. I don't have a B or an H, so that's it, and that's all.